Lesson 78, we talk about the product of squares. It's really day 2 of working with simplifying square roots. If we go back to a couple of days ago, we talked about simplifying problems like the square root of 8 that we see on the right. Now when we did this, we started with whatever the radicand was, that's the number inside the square root, and we did the prime factorization of it. 2 was prime, so we kept it. 4 we can break down 2 and 2. Both of those 2's are prime. So what we did then, if you recall, was we created another square root, and we could say, well, if 2 times 2 times 2 is equal to 8, then the square root of all those products is equal to the square root of 8. And now let's recall again that after we did this, we looked for our pairs. And it is from those pairs we create our perfect square roots. We said that the square root of 2 times 2 is the same thing as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And lastly, the square root of 4 we know is 2. And we could simplify that the square root of 8 was equal to 2 square roots of 2. This is all review. Again, we talked about this the other day. So if we go back to example number 1, where we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 12, there's a couple different ways we could go about it. First thing we could do is just simply multiply those two numbers together, because that's what we're doing there, and seeing what happens. If I multiply 3 times 12, notice I come up with the square root of 36. Now what do we know about the square root of 36? Well, simply, that's a perfect square root, and it goes down to 6. Now, not all of these problems are going to be this easy, but you can see that's one route that we can take. Let's go ahead and move on to example 2. In example 2, we have the square root of 18 times the square root of 8. Now, in the previous example, we just started by multiplying the 18 and the 8 together. But notice, if we multiply those two, we're not going to get a perfect square root. So maybe another method would be to start by doing the prime factorization of each number. The prime factors of 18, 9, and 2, where 2 is prime, and 9 is 3 and 3. So we have all of those values. If we look at 8, 8 can go down to 2 and 4, 2 and 2, and we have all of those primes as well. So now what we can do is that we can represent 18 by 2 times 3 times 3, and then we can multiply that by all the products of 8, or all the factors, which is 2, 2, and 2. And now what we want to do at this point, before we start finding our pairs, is let's go ahead and combine all of these factors into one radical. So I have 4 2's, and then I also have 2 3's. And notice when we look for our pairs, there's one pair, here's our second, and here's our third. Notice we have none left over. So when we put those pairs in their own radical, two times 2 is 4, 2 times 2 again is 4, 3 times 3 is again 9. And don't forget your square roots, because now we have found those perfect square roots. We have 2, 2, and 3, and we multiply all those together, we come up with 12. So believe it or not, we go back to the beginning. The square root of 18 times the square root of 8, that is equal to 12. We have one more problem that we want to go over. Example number 3. We have 3 times the square root of 6 times the square root of 15. Now notice this is very similar to example number 2, but the only difference is now we have a whole number out in front of the square root. That doesn't change our process. We are just going to come back to that 3 later on. But let's start with what we've done before. We start with those radicands, the 6, and we do the prime factorization to get 2 and 3. Let's now do the prime factorization of 15. We know that's 3 and 5. There they are. And both of those are prime, so we're done. So the first thing we can state is that 3 times, we rewrite 6 to be 2 times 3, and we rewrite 15 to be 3 times 5. Everybody okay there? Moving on. Now let's go ahead and take all of these factors that are under the square root and let's put it into one combined square root. So I have a 2, I have a 3, I have another 3, and I have a 5. And at this point, let's go ahead and identify those pairs. Notice the only pair that we have is those 3's right there. So what do? We take those pairs, we put them in their own radical, and everything else left over, recall we put those in the radical at the very end, 2 and 5. What do we do now? 3 times 3 we know is 9. 2 times 5, let's go ahead and multiply those two together to get the square root of 10. And we're just about done. Square root of 9 is 3. And lastly, we can multiply the 3 and the 3. We get 9 square roots of 10. So for this particular problem, we have taken 3 times the square root of 6 times the square root of 15, and we have simplified it down to 9 times the square root of 10. Now, all of these are very good example problems to keep in your notes. I expect you to keep them. For practice problems, here's what I want you to go ahead and complete. I want you to go ahead and try A, B, and D. Go ahead and attempt those 3 problems from the practice set on page 522. Good luck, and if you have questions, we can go over those on Tuesday. Have a good day.